All right, so I think we're safe to get started. There may be people starting to trickle in. We did have a couple Zoom technical issues at the beginning of this, so thank you all for being patient with us as we do that. Welcome everyone to the San Diego City College's 6th Annual Social Justice and Education Conference, Dignity to Dream. It's nice that we have this safe online platform, right? Even if we kind of are getting Zoom eyes from our computer screens. I want to inform everyone that the session is being recorded and archived. So later in the session, if you want to ask a question, you can always drop it in the chat or you can unmute. We do have protection of privacy, just we don't have profile pictures or camera screens on except for the presenters, just to make it a little bit easier. I have a small script to read about safe spaces. So the entire conference is committed to creating a safe space and community that values a collective vision of justice and equality. I want to start out by acknowledging that City College is built on Kumeyaw indigenous lands. So we should always recognize the people past, present, and their land that we're on. We aim to amplify voices that have been marginalized as a means to reimagine and enact a more representative and equitable future. Our intent for the conference is to collaboratively build a safer and more inclusive space for our communities. In doing so, we must uphold certain values and leave no space for harmful and disrespectful behavior. So violence of any form is not welcomed at this conference, right? This community includes all of us and it must be sustained by all of us. I want to recognize the work that is being done by Think Dignity and the mission that they have. And I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat for anyone interested in that. I also have a survey for the Social Justice Conference that I'll put in the chat as well. So you can do those on your own time if you wish. So we are excited to have Fonna, Forman, and Teddy Cruz here to share their expertise today. We'll have questions at the end. So again, you can use the chat feature or unmute yourself. You have to request to be unmuted, and you can use the raise hand feature towards the end of the session as well. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Teddy Cruz is an architectural designer and professor of public culture and urbanism in the Ucsd Department of Visual Arts. He is known internationally for his urban research of the Tijuana-San Diego border. Fonna Forman is a professor of political science and founding director of the Center on Global Justice at the University of California, San Diego. A theorist of ethics and public culture, her work focuses on human rights, climate justice, border ethics, and equitable urbanization. They work together, which I'm excited to hear about. And the session is titled Unwalling Citizenship. Forman and Cruz will discuss their work on citizenship culture at the US-Mexico border and the network of educational spaces they have co-developed with border communities to cultivate regional and global solidarities. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for the land acknowledgement, truly, and for your commitment in this session and in this conference to justice, equity, and respect. The idea of justice, and equity in education is very close to our hearts, and we're big fans of City College. So we're really happy to be here with you today to discuss our work together at the San Diego-Tijuana border. We really see this zone as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe. Political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We all of us here, we live just a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And although the news cameras are gone, tens of thousands of Central American migrants wait at our wall right here for asylum that never comes, reviled by the Mexican public sometimes as a nuisance, right, an infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, separated forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. It's been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable sort of psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully, there's relief on the horizon. But the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is drawing even more people north. With misinformation circulating on social media, conditions are really intensifying every day. And climate change will inevitably accelerate these flows in the years to come. A recent United Nations survey at our border found that 72% of arriving migrants are agricultural workers, and that agricultural instability was a major factor in their decision to walk north. So global injustice is an intensely local experience here where we live. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront and productively circumvent unjust power. Some of this contestation is about sanctuary and protecting people who are targeted by the state. Some of it is working through the courts, the detention centers and other institutions of power to advocate for people who are ensnared in the net of political violence. Some of it takes the shape of bottom-up civic agency and exposes and counters unjust power and confronts hateful political narratives. But much of it arises informally through everyday collective practices of adaptation and resilience in conditions of scarcity and danger. Over the years, we have accompanied some of this bottom-up emancipatory transgression, this sort of eruption of democratic will, in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. In recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists from around the world who engage in acts of performative protest. But we've sometimes been critical of this sort of uptick in cultural action that sort of dips in and out of the conflict. These things sometimes, they can be extractive in their processes, and their impacts on public consciousness very fleeting, sort of like the Instagram posts they generate. What happens the day after the happening, right? So instead, we've been advocating for a longer view of resistance, a kind of a more systemic approach to the drivers of injustice, and really, in the end, more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. These commitments have culminated over the years in a project that we would like to share with you today, the Ucsd community stations. Basically a network of public spaces that are located in vulnerable neighborhoods across the border region, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and collaborate on research, dialogue, educational activities, and urban design build projects in the city. The community stations are really the field-based sort of engagement arm of our design lab, which is based at the university at UC San Diego. So here we are with our team, with some of our community partners in Tijuana just before COVID-19 hit. It's kind of a nostalgic image for us. We have several core commitments that comprise a community stations model, which we think is highly replicable for colleges and universities everywhere. So I'm going to introduce these commitments. Teddy will then take you on a tour of the community stations themselves, all 4 of them. And then I will conclude with a few words about our programming at these sites and how they link our local border context with sites of conflict across the world. So to begin, our first commitment, we localize the global. We've always resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens out there in the world somewhere. Living and working where we do, we don't need to send our students far away to learn, about territorial conflict, migration, poverty, climate justice. All of those things are right here. We are minutes away from an international border in crisis. And this really enables an amazing proximity between the campus and the field, between theory and practice, what we like to call a critical proximity. Now, going local here, of course, means recognizing ourselves as a region a site of interdependence. Despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric that's designed to divide us, we are a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future here is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love. These things don't stop at walls. We build trust bridges, long-term partnerships between our university and border communities. We're not like some kind of almost flaky university programs that come and go, sort of arriving, diagnosing a crisis, extracting data, and then disappearing. We don't disappear. We're there for the long haul. Closely related, we decolonize knowledge. We are keenly attuned to the power dynamics when universities arrive in communities, and we're critical of both extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. We don't do applied research, and we don't do charity. We are not a service learning program. Academic culture is filled with assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems, if only the world would listen to us. We instead are committed to horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledges and agency. Everyone contributes, everyone learns, and we do things together that no one really can do alone. Along these lines, universities too often take for granted the resources that communities invest when they work with us: time, space, social capital, labor, knowledge, as a matter of epistemic justice and labor equity. These contributions always need to be validated and compensated. We curate two-way flows, inside out and outside in, really unsiloing our campus, inviting activists and community leaders to teach with us. And ultimately, we're thinking outside the box, literally, about what it means for a university to commit to diversity, cultivating skills of cultural sensitivity, empathy, and awesome respect. These are skills that are best learned in situ. Today's challenges are complex and they demand intersectionality. But everything that we do on climate change, environment, health, labor, education, urbanization, all of this is refracted through the lens of social transformation. Ultimately for us, in our work, it's about changing hearts and minds and tackling inequality, about increasing public knowledge about the roots and springs of injustice, and growing connected, civically engaged border communities capable of collective action, advocacy, and productive contestation. Ultimately, we've been committed to building what we call a cross-border citizenship culture, a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or by the documents that you carry in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently and artificially disrupted civic space, like we do here in the border region. Those who benefit from narratives of separation and mistrust prefer that we remain a fragmented public, that the idea of citizenship divides us rather than unites us. We want to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of coexistence and cross-border citizenship here in this contested region. Our cultural aspirations are inspired by a 20th century lineage of Latin American civic experimentation and urban pedagogy. In context of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, and Bogota and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through participatory cultural action. The way Antanas Mockus in Bogota, for example, used street mimes, urban games, and theatrical public performances to transform urban norms from the bottom up. Or the way Medellin, Colombia, transformed urban remainders in forgotten zones into vibrant civic spaces that prioritized access and inclusion. Like Medellin's now legendary Library Parks project, our community stations represent a model of shared urban development between public universities and communities to fight the creeping gentrification of border neighborhoods. Each of our community stations is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between the campus and the community. And finally, we reject conventional strategies of urban beautification that turn our public spaces into sites of leisure and consumption. We question the agendas of this kind of pop-up culture, which accelerates gentrification and often appropriates art and culture for private ends. Really, they become an apology for the absence of more substantial public investment in the city. We believe that public space must become civicized. We love this beautiful concept by James Tully, a site of dialogue and contestation, and infused with resources and tools to increase public knowledge and community capacity for political and environmental action. So now a tour of the UCSD community stations, the 4 of them, and just a hint about what happens in these spaces.
For us, urban justice is a distributive concept requiring not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. We designed this reciprocal knowledge infrastructure as both a collaborative education platform, but also a model of shared urban intervention, as we claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university can be leveraged for communities to develop their own public spaces and social housing. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations specialize social justice, mobilizing cross-border citizenship culture through cultural action. With our community partners, we have co-developed 4 community stations, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana. So we will take you from north to south. The UCSD Earth Lab Community Station is a partnership with Groundwork San Diego, an environmental justice nonprofit located in the low-income, primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood of Encanto, a community characterized by high unemployment, low educational attainment, food insecurity, and cyclical poverty. The station occupies a 4-acre vacant parcel owned by the San Diego Unified School District, who granted the parcel to our partnership to increase educational capacity for the 8 public schools within walking distance of the site. The goal was to promote circulations between traditional classroom-based learning and outdoor experiential learning. This access to municipal land gave us leverage to assemble a unique cross-sector collaboration between a major university, research university, a local school district, and a grassroots organization to co-develop public space, placing education at the center of community development. Before COVID-19 hit, 3,000 kids and their families circulated through the Earth Lab each year, and during the current transition, it continues to operate as an outdoor, socially distanced classroom. Recently, the school district committed capital monies towards a more refined physical resolution of the site for what has been so far a largely informal effort, while UCSD will invest in sustainable educational programming, research, and management, in collaboration with Groundwork, who will steward community participation. Pedagogic zones at the site will be focused on habitat restoration through energy, water, food, community programs, all wrapped by indigenous Kumeyaay knowledges and environmental practices. Ultimately, the UCSD Earth Lab Community Station will perform as an open-air climate action park designed for environmental education and climate justice. The district has also committed a school bond funding for a new climate action design building to anchor the site and as a pilot for post-COVID porosity in classroom design. This station will break ground in 2022. Moving south, the UCSD Casa Community Station is a partnership with the nonprofit Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latinx and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and worst air quality in San Diego County. The heart of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair, and which we were able to rescue through this project with our partners. During construction, the building had to be lifted for installing new foundations. During the times of so much political violence inflicted on this border community, the surreal image of the church levitating with Tijuana's informal settlements in the distance inspired a sense of hope for the local residents. With the adaptive reuse of this historic building as catalyst, we designed the Ucsd Casa community station as a double project. A parcel-sized social infrastructure, which you see here, made of spaces for cultural and economic activity, is flanked by affordable housing. The organizational design of the parcel through a system of linear strips with a variety of small-scale buildings performing different roles was also a deliberate strategy to mobilize diverse financial streams to fund the different building typologies. Leveraging programmatic investments by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support the educational, cultural, and research programming between the university and the community, Casa Familiar and UCSD secured capital investments by the Park Foundation and Art Place America to build the social service infrastructure. These investments enabled Casa Familiar then to qualify for a $9 million new markets tax credit development package facilitated by the municipality. Casa Familiar has become effectively an alternative developer of affordable housing for its own community of San Isidro, and public space was the detonator. We renovated the historic church then into a community theater with an outdoor stage. This performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar social programming, and on the other side by an open-air civic classroom pavilion. This social, educational, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We never imagined that this choreography of indoor and outdoor spaces would become a community asset during a global pandemic. Ultimately, the project advances a reproducible prototype for a small-scale development in low-income neighborhoods where buildings can collaborate to transform small lots into housing infrastructures for maximizing social economic exchanges. We completed construction of this station in February, just before COVID-19 hit, and the residents moved in. It's all locked down now, but it's a site built for social proximity, and we cannot wait to return in person to develop programs, cultural programs with our partners. Affordable housing, in other words, takes a different meaning here when it is deliberately threaded into social spaces for programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of local economy and cultural productivity, synergizing spaces, programs, and resources and people. This is an integrated social spatial system that is programmed between university and community. Let's imagine a small coalition of local artists, promotoras, and neighborhood youth collaborating with university curators, theater script writers, and visual artists who come together periodically to co-produce a play that explores an urgent issue facing the community, enacted by local youth in the community theater. These artistic productions are rooted in neighborhood stories and become bottom-up evidentiary material to increase public knowledge and policy transformation. Before moving across the border, allow me to pause for a moment to summarize a couple of concepts so far and share how the processes behind our two San Diego-based stations exemplify several core commitments, or as we call them, building blocks for our practice. In conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units into relational social systems. For us, housing must be public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges, mobilized by bottom-up urbanization, is the DNA for democratizing the city into more inclusive and plural environments. Zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architecture's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, the developer's spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction costs. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent us architects or artists from becoming developers of our own projects. And by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. The sweat equity, in other words, of architects, cultural producers, and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities and municipal protocols for accessing public parcels can be all bundled, aggregated to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. That's truly what our story has been. Moving now across the border, our two community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a few moments to describe this really dramatic context. This location is an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons clash with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, which is now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is profound. As we zoom in further, we witness a collision between the estuary in the US, the border wall, and the informality of the Laureles Canyon, which is home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon in Tijuana and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. This site sits literally 30 minutes away from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides. And all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. Because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows upstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bioregional and shared binational asset. Here, everyone, the border wall is an artifact of environmental insecurity. These impacts have intensified in recent years because a profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the open lands in Laureles Canyon in Tijuana have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been identifying and bundling unsquatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our partners in Tijuana, we are curating a coalition of state, municipal agencies, and grassroots organizations and universities on both sides of the wall. And we are now negotiating with the municipality in Tijuana to gain access to the remaining public lands inside the informal settlement. Another important contextual note before I introduce the Tijuana stations is that the Laureles Canyon has also been the site where we have advanced our research on informal urbanization. As we have written about over many years, the informal settlements of Tijuana are built with urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented, a metal frame appears from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials begin to thread the spaces, and in the next weeks, an informal house emerges. We have also taken note that multinational maquiladoras or factories surrounding these informal settlements typically benefit from easy access to cheap labor. Over the years, we have experimented with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. Because Tijuana is a city of multinational factories that prey on cheap labor, we have proposed an ethical loop where factories invest in emergency housing. Here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated materials into structural scaffolds as armatures for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory's engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typology is shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources can support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first example, being inside the factory, redirecting its material systems and surplus value, its profits, to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. We then work with our partners in the community to build early applications to demonstrate the adaptability of the system, such as this small bus stop to shelter Laureles workers from the sun. It was important, everyone, to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes, because our two community stations in Tijuana could not operate really without understanding and researching this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relationships and partnerships. Now to the stations themselves. The Ucsd Alacran community station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization led by activist pastor, economist Gustavo Banda, and pastor psychologist Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, Embajadores began construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigate unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. We have established a long-term partnership with them to co-develop a community station here to increase refugee housing capacity. We are accelerating production of the Mecalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems into housing infrastructures. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. We see migrant housing as a mechanism for generating jobs. To sustain the construction process over time, we are designing a sanctuary economy. We embed refugee housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. With the support of the Park Foundation, we have assembled a community-owned business, the Little Haiti Construction Cooperative, with a tool library, wood and metal fabrication machines, and trucks and tractors. The community, the migrant community and our activist partners will complete construction of the site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the canyon. The Ucsd Alacran Community Station began construction last summer with seed capital provided by New York-based philanthropists Robert Rubin and Stefan Samuel, whose collaboration on this project expands their commitment to the prefabricated social housing logics of post-war French architect Jean Prouvé. And finally, our Ucsd Divina Community Station. The station is a partnership with Colonos de la Divina Providencia, a Tijuana nonprofit that is rooted in the community of Divina. The nonprofit facilitates a variety of social services, including meals for youth, senior services, medical assistance, and environmental awareness. Using the Mechalux factory parts, the station takes the shape of a flexible scaffold to accommodate a variety of informal programs, including flea markets, cultural events, and a series of multi-level spaces to accommodate a small high school, all curated between Ucsd and our partners. At the Divina Station, we work with community leaders, students, and researchers on educational programming through which young people understand zones of vulnerability in their own neighborhoods, emphasizing ecological conservation of species and habitat restoration. It's never too early to begin. We have committed to elevating children here as the cross-border citizens of the future. Our two Tijuana-based stations have also advanced important building blocks for our practice, two in particular. For us, informal urbanization is not just an aesthetic category, but a praxis, a dynamic set of foundational urban operations from below that counter and transgress the imposition of top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. While hospitality is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. But as needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality into inclusion. Thinking beyond shelter is the foundation for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion. Migrant shelters, we argue, can be agile for negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent.
So these are the 4 UCSD community stations. There's so much to say about them, about our amazing partners, about what we do in these spaces. While all of the stations focus on different issues that reflect the priorities of each of these communities, they are all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy teaching, participatory design build, and cultural production. They all aspire to increase public knowledge, challenge divisive political narratives, foster solidarity and collective agency, and advance strategies from the community level to counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. Now, these activities often invite encounters with formal institutions of power that govern the border zone. Sometimes these meetings facilitate mutual recognition and cooperation, but sometimes they don't. For us, the goal is less about resolving conflict than about understanding it, recognizing it, and democratizing it. We see democracy in the border zone as a fundamentally bottom-up process of exposing and rendering more accessible the complex histories and mechanisms of injustice that are too often hidden within official accounts of who we are, right? Racist political narratives in the United States portray the border as a site of rupture and criminality. but we have been committed to generating different stories, counter narratives about life in this region that are grounded in the experiences of those who inhabit it. We are a region of flows and circulation, shared practices and aspirations, alliances of hearts and minds, regardless of the wall that restricts the movements of our bodies. In this sense, the community stations are a cross-border observatory, a platform for constructing what we like to think of as an elastic civic identity from the bottom up. With our partners, we curate unwalling experiments, that dissolve the wall, using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a civic skill, the ability to stretch and return between local and more expansive ways of thinking over and again, ultimately to understand one's challenges within broader dynamics and processes, and to envision opportunities for solidarity and collective action across walls. Here at the border, the idea of the bioregion, right, the binational watershed system, has been a powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that Homeland Security had carved into the wall between Laureles Canyon and the estuary that Teddy introduced to you earlier. We negotiated a permit with US Homeland Security to transform the drain into an official port of entry southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-representation as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration officials were waiting on the other side of the wall to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 activists, residents, and representatives from the municipalities of San Diego and Tijuana, who are typically, at odds with one another. As we moved together southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater flowing northbound toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports amplified the most profound interdependencies of our border region. The great insight here was that protecting the vulnerable US estuary demands a shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this cultural experiment, we went down, but sometimes nurturing civic elasticity requires ascending above what's familiar. In the early 20th century, Patrick Geddes, a sociologist, designed the Camera Obscura in the center of Edinburgh, basically a 5-story observation tower that enabled people to look out across the region and comprehend the environmental systems that organize it. He was the one who coined the term regionalism. For Geddes, rising above and comprehending was essential for constructing, a civic identity and collective political will. Now, imagine a Mexican child standing along the eastern rim of Laureles Canyon, hundreds of feet above the border wall, right here at a place called Mirador. Imagine she plants her feet facing due west with the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the US to her right. Below to her immediate left, she sees the dense informal settlement where she lives. She can spot her house, her school, and experience their proximity to a country that she and her family are not allowed to enter. Below to her immediate right, almost directly beneath her feet, she sees the border wall, which from this vantage looks like a flimsy and ridiculous strip that's been inserted into a vast and powerful natural system. Lifting her eyes a little bit more, she sees the green expanse of the Tijuana River estuary with its vulnerable wetland habitats and the sediment basins, those sort of light beige strips that have been contrived to catch the northbound flows of waste from her community. And further beyond still, you can't see it in this photo, downtown San Diego rising vertically into the sky. From this vantage, all the characters of this contested zone come to life. We've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years. among children, our students, policymakers, even foundation presidents. There are few places on earth, we would argue, where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of wealth and poverty can be so vividly experienced. But in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between nation on the one hand and nature on the other are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the US and Mexico. Over the years, we've collected aerial photos that document precise moments when the jurisdictional line of the border collides with natural systems, producing really powerfully illustrating what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus project stretches our elastic civic aspirations to a continental scale. Mexus, this project, visualizes the border without the line. It dissolves the border itself into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems that are bisected by the international border. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory: tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many more informal crossings, 15 million people and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018, exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale. In community stations programming, this project Mexus becomes a provocation for dialogue about shared bioregional civic identity among Mexicans, Americans, and diverse tribal nations who inhabit this contested space. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, is a visualization project we call the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana, across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30 and 38th degrees north. Along its trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. Obviously, the US-Mexico border, the most trafficked international border in the Western Hemisphere. The Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the main route from North Africa into Fortress Europe. The Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, emblematized by Israel's 50-year military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. India-Kashmir, a site of intense and enduring territorial conflict between Pakistan and India since the British partition of India. The border between North and South Korea, representing decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this red political equator along the climatic equator, below in green, was an astonishing discovery for us because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums. It's sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export. It's sites of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. It also contains what our past president called shithole countries. And when these parallel equators are applied to the Pierce quincuncio projection, which is really a map of the globe from above, look how the Arctic becomes protagonist, with its melting ice caps, detonating hemispheric conflicts through sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. Really, in the end, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and forced migration is the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the very beginning, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere, and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that presentation. It was, I mean, yeah, Terry and I were both getting chills, and I think there were so many things that we could talk about, and definitely please, everyone, for questions, please either drop them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute you. I just want to speak on several things, but I think one thing that was really prevalent throughout your whole talk was the sense of belonging, and how far away we've kind of come from that. Even when we hear about the border, we don't think like it's never humanized in the sense of people there, right? Like it becomes this obstruction or this object and not about all the people there. And so I think that parallels so much with people's sense of belonging at a university, if they're first generation, if they're, and so there were just so many parallels in your talk that, I mean, you can zoom in and out of all these different moments. And it was, and not even a sense of belonging, but a sense of importance with how much you're giving back to the community, not just belonging to a place, but feeling important in that place, having a voice, being able to do something, being able to be part of something. And the other thing I thought that was just so, I mean, I have a ton of notes, but the sort of how you're working with places and seeing how those places change. And it just speaks so much to, these buildings have life just like we do. We're not chosen where we don't choose where we're born, right? But so much of it is wrapped into our identity. And these buildings that can then have these different histories and continue, and they're not very different from us in that way. And so it was, yes, thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
Anna, thank you.
There's so much we could say in response to your question. The one thing I would say is that one of the things that's always driven us is that, life is different here than people on the outside say it is, right? We experience life different here. So many of the people who are probably watching this have some sense of what it means to be a cross-border citizen, or who have family members and friends who are cross-border citizens who are navigating this wall every day with amazing solidarities on both sides. So we've always wanted to take definitions away from people who use power irresponsibly in sites of conflict, in sites of violence. And one of the things we've really been fighting against, and this is a big part of what we mean by belonging, is that communities that are vulnerable are often described as needy or lacking power, lacking agency. And one of the things that has been most amazing to Teddy and I as researchers and as activists, we kind of cross the line between them, is how much agency and power there are in these communities. And we learn more from them than they ever do from us. Like, we are learning what it means for communities to feel invested in their own future. So we don't come in, designing for people. That's like, we really resist that idea. Everything is horizontal and collaborative because there's so much agency and genius in these communities that are really struggling against things, injustices that are being sort of piled upon them.
And sometimes that agency obviously needs incentives or levels of activation in a sense, and that's where we see an incredible role for art and culture. We always think that art can really be a mediatory system to facilitate access, let's say, to that recognition, or to the understanding, the critical understanding of that belonging. Because it's not ultimately evident. It's not enough just to belong, let's say, just to define it as such, but to understand it as a set of practices, right? And that depend on levels of mutual recognition, but also mutual responsibilities to share the space of the city and to understand the interdependencies that are necessary really to advance, in this case, social justice, ethics, etc. So yes, I think it's in the end, even though we all know all of those elements are necessary, maybe at times they're not that evident. There might be methods, there might be processes that we need to ultimately enact as cultural producers to engage others. I think that arts and culture, and we've learned a lot, as we mentioned, from Latin America, can become tools, really important tools for new methods of community engagement and civic participation. And finally, I think what you were mentioning is that, again, this issue of recognition and belonging requires also a political stance, in a way where we really are responsible to understanding the specificity of the conflicts and the conditions that have produced the crisis, and to enable those to be the materials for us as scholars and researchers and artists, I think, and activists. It's almost like we call it flying and walking at the same time. You know, we need to see a kind of macro set of conditions, but also really let those hit the ground to understand the types of social, political, and environmental situations and conditions that need to be altered, reorganized, you know, and so on. So yes, in a way, it's a lot of responsibility. I think belonging, that's what I'm trying to say, belonging carries with it a huge responsibility to advance mutual recognition.
And I think you touched on something else, is that the amount of time it takes to fight for what you're fighting for, and the amount of time it takes to to cross the border. And that was one thing I think quite a bit about with, and even in this now with Zoom, several students have said, wow, actually I'm able to spend a bit more time on my work because my transportation time is being cut down. And that's something that's like, it really, how much time you spend doing that. And I always wish, like, the gift I could give, I wish I could give students back all the time they've taken just because of where they're born and the obstacles that were set up for them. It's like, oh, they would have had, 10 more hours to work on this project, 10 more hours to be an artist in this way, or 10 more hours to work on something. And it's the amount of time, just, you know what I mean? Just because it's because of this, yes, imaginary line, that is made a scar on the earth.
Yeah. It's funny, we hear a lot in this region, and politicians like to talk a lot about making a more efficient border. And the business community gets involved in this, because a border that is slow doesn't allow the free movement of goods and services, right? Which we've we like that people want to make a more porous border, but from the perspective of human rights, it's so disruptive of everyday life. I mean, we have students on our campus as well who, they struggle with the border in the morning to get to campus. And then they go home at the end of the day and cross the border again the next morning. And some of our students have been living that way their entire lives, like moving back and forth just to go to school in the morning and so forth. So, we're aware of that. Obviously nothing can replace the beauty of being in person. And something magical happens in dialogue and a sense of connection when you're sitting together in propinquity, like in physical proximity to one another. But we've also found during this last period, during COVID, that our relationships with our partners in Tijuana took on a new life because we were able to see each other and engage one another so frequently. I mean, we've developed an amazing sort of pathway of constant exchange with our partners that's really improved the quality of our work together. And I have a feeling, even once we get back into the world, some of the lessons that we're learning about communicating remotely will stick with us. They can't replace what happens in person, but they can enhance it. And they can, in many ways, be much better for our planet. I know that, Teddy and I, we're involved in communities and we fly a lot, and we're rethinking the way we live and the way we communicate our work because of this period. And I think that's going to be true for a lot of people.
Anna, can I just mention something, just to add a thought to what you said about belonging, because you also obviously mentioned the interface with communities. And I think that it made me think that belonging really ultimately is not an individual, must not be an individual concept, but a collective one. And I think that it is clear that what we are arguing, obviously from the vantage point of being university professors, is that we cannot tackle the problems of the world today, the very dramatic crisis across any imaginable register today, from the single vantage point of our own fields or our individual kind of desires, but that we need to really tackle those problems collectively. So this notion of a collective imagination really and producing new forms of collaboration, of solidarity. These solidaristic practices is what we are after in this interface with community, and also to obviously develop the city, understanding that the survival of the individual depends on the health of the collective. This is a fundamental notion today, I think, because democracy for too many decades has been just simply understood as the right to be left alone, and not really synergizing or depending on or coexistence with others. I think we are entering a new period, hopefully post-COVID, that potentially would bring a different consciousness, I think, that really reconnects us to that potential of the collective.
And not theoretically, we experience this firsthand, how interconnected we are. And it's funny, when I see people who sort of refuse to comply with public health mandates and so forth, it's not just an issue of like personal stupidity, but it's an amazing act of disregard for your fellows. And I think so many of us have realized how inherently interconnected we are through COVID. Before COVID hit, people were trying to make that argument about climate change. It's just, it wasn't sinking in. It still seemed like it was a problem for somebody else. And it's almost like COVID has become a kind of the idea of a canary in the coal mine. It's sort of, it's like a harbinger of what's to come, because climate change is going to be in all of our living rooms in just a few years. And if we didn't learn from this, we're going to be in big trouble.
Terry, go ahead.
I got a question. Well, I mean, Jim asked it too, but I've been thinking about this whole time. So how can we as City College add students or both get involved somehow in your projects? And I know this is visionary and long-term, and students won't be here for long-term, but
Well, this has been our dream. I mean, we have wanted to connect more robustly with City College for a very long time. And for the last few years, I'd say 4 or 5 years, we've been partnering with the PATH program, which is a program that sort of provides pathways for community college students in the arts and humanities to transition to UCSD. And a lot of the students who've participated in PATH have participated in our student programs at UCSD. But what we want to do is to expand that partnership even more in the years to come. And we're actually in conversations about doing that now, and directing resources. So City College and UCSD both receive funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And what we're trying to do is to connect those two grant sources more robustly to create genuine pathways and really include community college students in our summer programming alongside our UCSD students. So we're accelerating toward this. So there will be formal opportunities for students to get involved, but if in the meantime, students are interested in other ways, less formal ways of getting involved, they should definitely contact us at the Center on Global Justice at UCSD, because we often have opportunities for volunteers.
It is a great opportunity, Terry, that the Mellon Foundation has funded this program, the PATH program, through the Division of Arts and Humanities at UCSD in collaboration with City College. And obviously, Kelly Mayhew, already faculty, very active in all of these issues. Yeah. And now you, Terry, I mean, we are going to be working, we have already begun working a bit in one of the community stations. So I think that we want to intensify those connections so that the PATH program and the UCSD community stations, which while different programs, they are really addressing the same issues, and we are trying to connect the dots basically.
And I want to say one more thing. One of the reasons why we're so excited about working with City College and the community stations is because so many of these students, these are very recognizable communities to them. And so how can they use their education, right, to be the change in their own communities? I'm like, I want to cry, because that's ultimately always been our goal. And so many of our students at UCSD are from far away, and they love these projects, but they don't feel as invested in this city as City College students do, right? So that's ultimately, very, very important to us. I think Carrie has a hand raised.
I'm trying,
Hello.
there you are.
Thank you so much for this. It's just been absolutely amazing to watch with the videos and the just the closeness of it. You know, there's so much room there, and it just felt parts of this felt very intimate in a really lovely way. It's funny because I've been using Alberto Rios's poem about the border, double sonnet, and some of the artwork that you showed, and some of JR's artwork, the guy that built that table.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is there a chance for city students to work on some kind of project-based learning thing where they're building arts that span or somehow address what you're working on?
You know, yes. In fact, it would be such a wonderful thing. And we should say, you know, the community stations have been around for a while, but the spaces are really sort of accelerating right now. And so we're thinking about creative ways to increase programming at these sites so that the sites really become an asset for university or college community partnerships. So if you have ideas like that, please, again, get in touch with us. I mean, we would love to hear ideas from City College, a project-based course, right, in one of the community station sites would be a brilliant experiment. We would love it.
It's fundamental to the programming, really, that we are co-producing, co-curating, and co-developing with our partners. That is really an experiential project-based sort of processes, because somehow it enables the kind of not only the translation of the issues, but through a more empathetic ways, let's say the transference of experiences. So, you know, I teach in the visual arts department, and often, you know, I don't want to get into this issue right now, but when working with communities, often we tend to reduce a lot of the histories, the practices, let's say, to maybe just simply an iconographic project, which is nevertheless important. Images are fundamental for histories, but we tend to forget, and I'm saying this in the context of some projects that we're developing with the Kumeyaay, where in fact what is essential to be translated are not just the metaphors or the fixed iconographic systems, but in fact the practices that were essential in terms of ancient methods to really tackle climate issues. And so there is something that we are interested about, the art being an experiential system, a performative system to really reenact those everyday practices into new forms of knowledge, let's say, for a moment. So it's definitely, here is also the spoken word, right? Poetry and literature and many other art sort of spaces, let's say, of operation. We're trying to really connect those to those experiences on the ground. So you are right, and please contact us.
Contact us.
Yeah.
And anybody, so our work is based in the Center on Global Justice at UC San Diego. Teddy and I direct that center, and the community stations are the main project within it. So there's a contact number at the Center on Global Justice, and that would be the best way to get in touch with us.
And Carrie, thanks for sharing that poem. We will take a look at, we got the link.
Thank you.
I just put the link in the chat for everyone.
Perfect.
I had one question, unless anyone else didn't. But I was wondering, it was so neat to see your plans and, you know, how it was already indoor and outdoor spaces, and how, I mean, I was just thinking like, oh my gosh, because you had done all that work in February. And I mean, I had this like sense of relief that it was like, oh, it's like, you know, safe, and it's, you know, it was just beautiful to see that. And I was wondering if there's any way you two are starting to, or like, what are you thinking about when you're redesigning spaces now because of this time that we're in? What have you started to, percolate?
Yes, you know, it's interesting because even before the health crisis, obviously, we had already been working on this open air climate action park, because a lot of the efforts with our community partners and some of our colleagues at Ucsd they have been very much interested. We have been interested in informal education, experiential education, connecting to the environment itself through, again, project-based sort of learning outdoors beyond the classroom. And so all of those interests were there, but now it has become it's really the new paradigm. I mean, how do we rethink schools so that they are always about porosity and flexibility, adaptability from between the inside and the outside, indoor, outdoor. But yes, for us, in fact, that community station, the 4-acre open air climate action park, which is next door to MTM, middle school in Encanto. So they operate beautifully as a kind of double project, right? An indoor education, which is really the school, but the students can come outdoors. So this circulation between the inside and the outside is very much deliberate, is developed deliberately to really connect the two. That's what makes the project unique, because there are many other projects across the nation that we've researched, like there are open air science museums, but there is not that, we didn't find any project that specifically, let's say, engages the curation of that circulation between the indoor and to the outdoor and back. But then also the station in San Isidro, we never thought, because we designed the small parcel with housing and a community theater and the outdoor sort of pavilion for, we call it a civic classroom, and the civic or the social service pavilions, all of these infrastructure, let's say, to connect housing. Again, part of the argument is that we were making, that housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of support, that those interstitial, let's say, outdoor spaces would really become interesting models for a post-COVID, let's say, rethinking of housing, that housing cannot just be left on its own devices. It needs to be connected to immediate, very, very close by services. So yes, obviously the public health crisis is now making us think even further about these issues, because we are hoping that after this period, we really will not flee the cities, as is being said, but return to them with more vehemence, more commitment to kind of social proximity. And therefore, we need to rethink all those paradigms. What is housing? What is public space? And what is density ultimately?
And if I could add just one thing about the significance of outdoor sort of experiential spaces for education. I mean, one of the things, and the research has been pretty clear on this, is that young people who grow up deprived of green spaces because they live in sort of concrete sort of areas of the city, because there may not be a capacity in the family to travel to green spaces or to attend summer camps in green spaces. You know, there's a huge sort of equity dimension to access to things that are green and to food that is green and all of this. So we've really been committed to activating outdoor spaces in neighborhoods where young people can develop a sense of environmental empathy at a very young age. And being in green spaces in one's neighborhood also can increase a sense of agency in that neighborhood. This is actually my neighborhood and where I connect with the earth. I mean, these are not theoretical things that you learn in a classroom. These are experiential things. I mean, even like during COVID, I feel sometimes I'm so cooped up inside all the time. Just going outside and breathing the air and seeing the sky and the trees, it changes one's perspective on things. So, and it's true for kids as well. So we're really committed to the outdoor dimension of formal education.
And by the way, this is primarily an issue in low-income neighborhoods.
Yeah, exactly.
This connectivity that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Because public space is absent sometimes.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
And it goes right back to that sense of belonging, like belonging to this earth, right? Belonging to, you know, all of those ecosystems. And when you don't have that around you, how, you know, how do you feel connected?
So one of the things that we're framing our educational sort of programming, particularly at the Earth Lab station in the fall, as you know, in a post-COVID world, kids are coming back to school. I'm sure there must be like just incredible disorientation. You know, when you're little, a year is forever. I mean, just forever. So it's about sort of reconnecting with yourself as a social creature, reconnecting with others, and reconnecting with the earth. And this is the way we're kind of staging the sort of empathetic process of returning to school. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really tough, actually, I think, for a lot of kids. It's gonna be tough for me to get back into a classroom, you know, just our lives have become so routinized in these sort of virtual ways. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll check the chat. Does anyone else have any other questions? We're getting close to time. so I
Yes,
wanna
another
make sure-
question.
Yeah.
Even if it's not related to the material, like,
Yeah, anything.
I find it really interesting, just that again, going back to that, we're talking about outdoor education, going back to like the early, I don't know, the Depression era where they were gardening outside, and all that was
Yeah.
part of all the elementary education. And when I started, you know, at the elementary school, my kids went to school, we started so many different little areas around campus of being outdoor spaces, just with logs and things. And now, you know, I'm working with the architects at City College for a new master plan. I'm thinking, you know, like, we don't need to spend tons of money on this stuff, just building outdoor spaces. And yeah, all our classes can be more outdoors. And I think it's just, it's amazing that's already, you know,
yes.
again, yeah.
Yeah.
Terry, that's interesting, because in one of the workshops that we developed in San Isidro with our partners a long time ago, when we were planning these projects, by the way, these projects have taken so long, it requires a really masochistic, you know, sort of spirit in a way. But that was one of the interesting questions that emerged in one of the community workshops, that when we were asking the question with the community, you know, what is density? And somehow the conversation and the way it developed, one of the community members, one of the residents, opened up that very provocation. Can density be measured less by buildings and more by spaces? Spaces that really need to be ultimately designed and equipped with support systems for anticipating sociability and encounter. That, yeah, we are so dominant. This notion that, you know, we are, as architects, I'm an architect, obviously Fonna is a political theorist, but sometimes we say, almost in a suicidal way as architects, that the future of the city depends less on buildings at this moment and more on reorganizing, reconfiguring social and economic relations. And that's something that designers or cultural producers can really intervene into. But ultimately, it's a space. It's a qualitative aspect of space. It's not just objects, buildings, you know, that are just thrown in the territory indiscriminately. So more attention about space as a kind of as a social register. That's what you are getting. Yes.
And I just saw one more question come in. I think we'll have time for this last question from Elizabeth. She asks, how does law and legal systems influence the work you do? Are you able to push for legislation to change our policies, and is that necessary?
Beautiful question to end.
Yes, yes, yes. We push hard against law and policies that are unjust. There's this wonderful historical distinction between law and justice. Just because a law exists doesn't mean it's just, right? And so we have to break law and justice apart. This was one of the beautiful things that Martin Luther King contributed to conversation about racial justice. We have to break law and justice apart. They're not the same thing. But sometimes changing legislation is a very slow process. It takes a long time to push against policy. Democracy is slow for a reason, right? It's very slow. And so really for us, it's what do you do in the meantime? And how do you work in the interstices of law, right up to the edge of law, right? Sometimes maybe encroaching into it a little bit and not getting caught. The point is that, you know, we're working with communities that have been severely marginalized by unjust laws and policies. And the question is, how can we unshackle local creativity from those unjust structures? And if there's any, and our perspective has always been, if there's anything that we can do from the base of this powerful research university up the coast, right? If there's anything we can do to help dislodge some of that immobility, we're gonna try to do it. So, you know, we find ourselves struggling against policy and law all the time. And occasionally we have successes where we actually get policymakers to look at things differently. I mean, that's really one of the things that we're trying to do through a lot of this sort of arts and cultural production in these communities is use that as voice to hold up to policymakers and say, look, you don't understand. You're making policies based on realities you don't understand, right? And so, I mean, you know, it was a great question because this is really what's driving us.
And another important thing to say quickly here, which is really about the way our practice operates, is that a lot of this work has been part of years of engagement in terms of the city, understanding dynamics in the city, primarily bottom-up urban energies in the hands of people and communities that are absent of the radar of institutions. And so as cultural producers, if we can call ourselves that, or architects or researchers, urban researchers, we've been interested not only in understanding the positive impact of immigrants in transforming neighborhoods in San Diego into more incredible, more complex social and economic environments in places that otherwise are hugely homogenized by the imposition of planning and so on. So that energy, that bottom-up energy, I think needs translation. I'm talking about in a neighborhood where maybe an informal economy is plugged into a garage, or a granny flat, a little unit is built maybe illegally in the back of the house, but all of that is, as one of our activist partners said, that's common sense urbanization. But all of those transactions with economy, with negotiating property lines, with, you know, producing forms and models of solidarity and collaboration and local governance at the scale of migrant neighborhoods. We have been learning a lot from that, but that information needs to be represented politically while protecting those environments and those communities. So that's the role that we want to play. We want to mediate between that bottom-up energy and the transformation of top-down policy, because a lot of these projects have depended on negotiations with the municipality to allow us alternative land uses and densities. So yes, this is fundamental for us, and I'm glad you asked that question, because we are very much about transforming institutions. That's our aspiration, transforming exclusionary and injustice forms of urbanization.
Can I just say really quickly before we go, Danielle's question, just very, very quickly, because I know we only have 2 minutes. But
I was going to ask that. Perfect.
Yeah, because Danielle's question is really great. Like, how difficult was it working binationally to establish the stations in Tijuana? And, you know, did we have community buy-in? Well, we don't do anything without community. I mean, the community drives our work. We don't come to communities with ideas. We build relationships and come up with ideas together. Building stations in Tijuana is an entirely different urban ecology. I mean, institutions work differently. And the places where we're working in Tijuana are really marginalized. I mean, like, they're on the periphery and entirely neglected by the city. So we face entirely different kinds of challenges in getting projects off the ground there, but it's just a labor of love. And it's all about trust. That word hasn't come up yet today. Trust. It's all about trust. You can't come in to communities and try to rearrange their furniture. And that's the mistake that researchers often get into. They come from the university, they want to rearrange the furniture. Never, ever,
so
ever.
Want to qualify something for a moment. Yes, we come with ideas, but
ideas.
They are not imposed. And it is that curatorial kind of project of how those ideas meet. The ideas that we bring in, but also the ideas and knowledge and sensibilities of the community. The meeting of those knowledges, I think is a fundamental aspect of our work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, thank you. I want to say thank you to, of course, the Social Justice Conference and committee members and all the people that put in a lot of long hours to make this work. All the Zoom tech help that we've had. Terry for thinking to reach out to Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman, for everyone that showed up on Zoom, which is such a new platform. So thank you everyone that showed up. And of course, thank you Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman. This was, I mean, you're truly blurring conventional boundaries, models, merging fields, architecture, art, urbanism, theory, policy, art, culture. It's really exciting. So thank you so much. I have goosebumps and chills and sweats, and it's not COVID.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And thank you, Terry. Thank you.
And everybody who is here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.